Why, hello there. It's been a while, hasn't it? So I was thinking that during this whole coronavirus lockdown nightmare we're living in, a lot of us are trying to entertain each other by asking each other, what are the top 10 albums that made you who you are? What are the top 10 movies that had an effect on you? But as of yet, no one has asked me, and I haven't asked anybody, what are the top 10 books that made you who you are and that have a real impact on your life? And I don't just mean the contents of the book, but the actual physical item itself, because sometimes that tells a story too. And I always remember there was an episode of Seinfeld in which Jerry Seinfeld says, why would you keep books around? What, are you going to read them again? I realize Jerry Seinfeld doesn't actually sound like that, but that's just my go-to stupid voice for a stupid question. And my answer to that was yes. Why, yes, I would read the book again. And beyond that, I think we've all learned that books as a physical item are very useful for Zoom sessions. You can use them as a background, makes you look very elegant and smart, so there's a lot of value to that. And on that point, we're going to get started with this huge doorstopper of a book, very ubiquitous book on most Gen X shelves. It is Infinite Jest, David Foster Wallace. This book was very useful to me. When I first moved to New York, I had a rent-stabilized apartment, and those of you who know New York real estate know that those are rare, but you'll put up with a lot of shit because it's rent-stabilized. So my kitchen was horrible, and it had a mini fridge, and then there was a space, and then this really cheap counter that sagged. Aww. And so for 5 years, I just tucked this book in there, worked perfectly, like a dream, I tells ya. So Jerry Seinfeld, there you go. Books are useful. Next book I'm going to bring up is Jacqueline Suzanne's Valley of the Dolls. This particular copy has a great deal of meaning to me because when I first heard about this book when I was a teenager, its blockbuster heyday was decades past. So it was actually difficult to find this book, believe it or not. So I went to my local indie bookstore, Washington State, First Street, Langley, called Moonraker Books, run by a glorious woman named Josh. And I asked her how I could find a copy of this book. And when I went back 3 days later, because by the way, I spent so much time there, she was such a saint, Josh. She let me just hang out in the upstairs area reading as many trashy books as I wanted, and I never bought anything, so thank you, Josh. And she even gave me this book for free, because it's an old vintage copy, and I have subsequently purchased 2 more copies of this book, but this one will remain my favorite. Thank you, Josh. And thank you, indie bookstores. There was a question on Twitter in which the question was, who was your first black teacher? Which I thought was very interesting. And for me, he was a black professor of American history at University of New Orleans. And he assigned us this book, Carnival of Fury, really extraordinary book about the race riots of 1900 in New Orleans. And it gives a really detailed depiction of society at the time and the social and racial issues that were bubbling up at the time. Highly recommend it. And I am going to be doing a podcast very soon called Nights of Chaos, and it's going to be all different nights of civil unrest throughout history in our country. And I really love to tell this story because I think it's one that not many people have heard. So check this book out. So this is World's Best Fairy Tales, and as many of you know, my mother is from Finland. And when we first moved to Honolulu, she didn't know anybody, and she did what a lot of immigrants did back then. She just picked up the phone book and flipped through the pages until she found a Finnish last name, and the name was Laurila. And she simply called them up, said, hey, I'm Finnish. They said, great, come on over. And they became our friends like that. And they gave me this book when I was a very little kid, and I will tell you, it's got one of my favorite illustrations of all times. Hopefully I can put this in there. It's the Snow Queen. I used to just stare at that picture thinking it was so fascinating, this cold and cruel and awful ice queen. I thought she was really glamorous. So, it's a good one to have in my bookshelf. Again, back to my love of bookstores. This is from a used bookstore that I used to hang out in Seattle, in the University District. I cannot remember the name of it or even if it still exists anymore, but it was run by this crazy old guy, and I hung out there so much that one day he put me to work. I thought, well, what the hell, she's here all the time. He didn't realize that my math skills are so piss poor that I couldn't actually make change because he had this old register that didn't, automatically make the change. So that lasted one day. But he did give me this book, Enough Rope by Dorothy Parker. He said, Saara, you're witty and you're funny. I think you'd like this. But promise me you will not become cynical like her. And I promised him, I'm not sure I kept that promise, but I did keep the book. So, very good book. Like I say, these are not my pretty books. Actually, I didn't tell you this, but I'm telling you now. I didn't choose my pretty books. I've got plenty of gorgeous, Folio Society hardbacks, but these are just the books that have meaning to me personally. All right, so this book was the first purchase I ever made online, which again is one of those weird questions for those of us who remember life before you could purchase things online. And it's The Gentleman of the 16th of July, and it's not well written, but it is a true story about this crazy band of thieves that managed to rob a bank by going into the sewer and drilling up under the vault. And then they got in there and they actually had a picnic before they stole all the money and the gold and whatever else in there. They had a picnic and then they posted a bunch of porn all over the place. So the next morning, when the bank manager opens up the vault, it's porn and leftover picnic supplies and no money. Anyway, I got this from this great used bookstore in Massachusetts. But the point is, I would love to write a screenplay about this. It's such a great story. No, the book isn't well written, but somebody, maybe, would you like to write a screenplay with me? It's spectacular, I'm telling you. Great movie. Another janky looking paperback. We have a family friend named Joanne Galbraith, and I used to love to go to her house in Blaine, Washington. And I loved her basement because it was filled with all these old broken up toys from her children who were about 10 years older than me. So I was fascinated by these toys that were not from my generation. And then beyond that, she had a ton of drugstore paperbacks from different eras because her husband had run the drugstore in town for years and years and years. And in particular, these 1960s Agatha Christie's just fascinated me. So I am going to tell the truth now, Jojo. I stole about 10 of your Agatha Christie's. But I did keep them, and I will tell you, they still smell like your basement, which is an added bonus. So that's very important to me. This book I've chosen, Last Exit to Brooklyn. Obviously a great book, very depressing as you probably know. But I'm choosing this copy because this book is the only book I've ever loaned out to somebody and I didn't have to sort of bug them and prod them and say, hey, did you finish my book? Did you finish my book? Mr. Steve Cordell, he read it and returned it in a timely fashion. So Steve Cordell, you are my hero. This is actually one of the only good books I'm showing you as in terms of quality, because this is a first edition, although I didn't treat it like that because it's got coffee stains and it's obviously well loved. Andy Warhol's diaries, if you haven't read them, they're just so much fun. They're like Twitter before there was Twitter, and you can just sort of open it up to any page. You don't have to read the diaries sequentially. It doesn't really matter. It's all the same random bitchery. But what's great about this copy is that inside I kept Spy Magazine created an index at some point when it was released. They created an index so you could look up your favorite bitchery about various celebrities. So like, you've got you've got Hall, comma, Jerry, body odor of, comma, page 170. You can't put a price on that. That's spectacular. And that's the other reason I love physical books, because you never know what you're going to find. Like, you just shove weird things. And as another example, I don't know why this is in here. Obviously from a political science class of mine, it's a pamphlet on what is Marxism. Now, why that would be in Andy Warhol's diaries, who was probably the most capitalist person to walk the earth, I don't know. But there it is, and it's going to stay in there. And finally, we've got Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities. And I received this for Christmas from my dad one year. I was, I think, about 13 or 14. My family, that's our Christmas tradition. As I said, my mom is from Finland, which means we celebrate Christmas on Christmas Eve, and we would all give each other books. And then Christmas Day was very quiet. Like, the Eve was like, woo, and the celebration and the fun. And then Christmas Day was very quiet, as we would all read our books and just not talk to each other. I loved it. Anyway, but what I found funny about this book is, so again, this was for Christmas, and instead of like, hey, Merry Christmas, kid, or something, my dad simply wrote, E.W. Dutton, M.D. to Saara Dutton. And so on 3 separate occasions, I attempted to take this heavy book, I hauled it to 3 different events where I knew Tom Wolfe would be. because I thought it would be so funny if he would basically trump my dad's signature with his own, because it's his book, of course. For whatever reason, at each event, I either was nervous or it just didn't work out, and I never got the signature, and sadly now both men have passed. But it really would have been great. And I have to say, the other funny thing about Tom Wolfe is this book, Bonfire of the Vanities, was made into a terrible movie, really, really bad, with Tom Hanks and Melanie Griffith. Anyway, and when asked about it, Tom Wolfe simply said, well, I cashed the check. Anyway, so those are my top 10 books. I would love to see yours, if you have them. And in closing, I would like to quote the great director John Waters, who once said, if you go to somebody's house and they don't have any books, don't fuck them. All right, see you.